Welcome back. In a moment, we'll return to the issue of combat stress. First, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. 5 Canadian hikers have died after an avalanche hit a popular hiking trail north of Vancouver. Rescue workers say the group may have fallen as far as 500 metres when overhanging ice collapsed in high winds. The Chinese government is offering more than $70,000 for information leading to the arrest of spies in the country. The cash reward for information on infiltration, subversion and theft of information was announced in a Communist Party newspaper in Beijing. And scientists say record temperatures in Australia have permanently damaged 2/3 of the Great Barrier Reef. A 1,500-kilometre stretch of the World Heritage Site has been bleached by warmer water. Researchers say there is now a 0 prospect chance of the delicate coral recovering. Well, back to the issue of combat stress now, following the case here in the UK of a Royal Marine who killed an injured insurgent in Afghanistan. Former Marine Sergeant Rob Driscoll was serving in Helmand province at the time of that incident, and he joins me in the studio now. Welcome to Insight, Rob.
Good morning.
We heard there that 1 in 4, it is estimated, serving soldiers will suffer some kind of mental health difficulties. Do you identify that with that statistic?
Well, I've not heard that statistic before, but it does seem a realistic kind of figure, and I can speak from my own experience, and obviously seeing some of the guys that I was working with and in charge of deteriorate through the tour. I think there's a storm on the horizon, as they say.
Could you tell of the men under your command or in your unit which were being vulnerable to this, which were behaving, you know, not outside their training and everything else?
Yeah. On more than one occasion, I observed the degradation of certain people, and I observed it myself actually towards the end of the tour, whereby behaviour was not as I would expect and not as I'd seen them behaving.
What do they do? What are the signs?
I think it's, I mean, to try and put it into context, it didn't happen early. It would normally happen after an incident if we'd had a serious incident. And just that long, tiring effect, and then just seeing people literally break in front of you where they lose a little bit of the perception that they once would have had. And an example I can give you is, after we had a very, very traumatic day, one of the young Marines, he was just completely disorientated and wasn't aware where the threat was and where the friendly forces were. And this guy had been drilled, and I'd seen him perform in similar kind of circumstances, but on
so
this
as if
one
all
occasion,
his training had fallen away and he was just a lost soul out there.
Just a lost soul, randomly firing, you know, a high caliber weapon back, unfortunately, towards our own guys, because he was just so disorientated in the massive...
And just remind us, if you will, exactly the circumstances. We've heard about this extraordinary temperature, but also the extraordinary threat under which you and men like you were serving in then. Yes,
I mean, it was very intense, particularly on the last tour, the tour where the Al Blackman incident occurred. We were lighter on the ground than I'd ever been operationally before, so there was less of us. We were carrying some very sophisticated kit, but very heavy kit. The temperatures were relentless, in excess of 50 degrees on occasions, with a very, very high humidity. And the insurgency were very good at undermining everything we were trying to do. So we would plan and hope that we'd be on the ground for 3 to 4 hours, and ultimately 12 hours later, we'd be fighting our way back through ambushes, trying to get back to the safety or relative safety of the established checkpoints.
And there was the steady tick over of injuries, fatalities, loss of life, loss of your own side.
Yeah. You
were aware of that news trickled through to you on a regular basis?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I saw a lot of our casualties, not initially from my direct team, although I did have a few casualties, but you were aware of wider casualties around, and every evening we'd get a kind of a news round, which was relative to our task force, and more often than not, we'd hear about someone being severely injured or killed.
Take us back to the very fundamentals of soldiering. You fight for yourself, your unit, your country, your queen, wherever it might be, to the best of your ability.
Yes.
Then the battle's over. And then the rules state that you then have to treat any human being still alive, injured or whatever, whether they're combatants, friend or foe, exactly the same, and you turn into their doctor and their nurse.
Yes.
How are you trained to deal with that extraordinary switch from one role to another?
Well, we're not necessarily practiced and trained in that, and that's one of the lessons I think we perhaps need to accept, that more needs to be done in the future for the young guys.
It's a hell of a switch, isn't it?
Well, I've never actually experienced that. All the people that we fought were ultimately dead when we got there.
Right.
So we saw them at their worst state, and if we had arrested people and not had to use lethal force, we never completely switched. You know, there was still that kind of authority and aggression, because we had to maintain the fear of capture for these guys going back through the system when they start to get questioned by the people that question them. So,
and just to understand the risks involved, so theoretically, an injured combatant, you're suddenly their doctor, their nurse, whatever it might be. The British forces, the Afghan forces you're working with, have resources. Yep. They might be a long way away, they might be a helicopter, they might be a team that would come up by road. Just explain to us the risks that those would-be rescuers would have faced coming to deal with an injured, yes, hostile.
The problem is, and this is my opinion, but the problem is that the insurgency part of their tactic would be to lure the responding call signs, so these assets that you refer to. That's what they wanted. You know, they weren't really interested in just killing the people with the guns and walking around. They wanted to destroy the helicopters, undermine the roads, and destroy the vehicles that we were using. You know, they were really about causing as much terror and carnage as they can through every incident. So the shoot and scoots would normally lead on to something, so we'd have people shoot at us, and we knew that they were employing these tactics, so we'd then have to advance very, very carefully, because we knew there'd be an explosion somewhere, and then after that explosion there'd be another explosive device ready to hit the people that would come and, you know, respond to any casualties. And that applied exactly to the same if we were to inflict casualties on their side. They would see it as their kind of dying duty to kind of inflict more ISAF casualties.
But even allowing for that, and even allowing for the temperature and the circumstances and the loss of comrades and everything else, I'm tempted to say technically speaking, because I know it is a technicality, but the letter of the law and the way that British soldiers and British Marines are trained is that you adhere to the Geneva Conventions.
Yes.
And what Sergeant Blackman did was a murder. Now the courts have said it wasn't. All right, it was, but he took that man's life.
Yes,
he brought it to a premature end.
That's how it appears from the video. Yeah, we can't deny that. Having spoken to Al before, after, and during, you know, he's always maintained that he really wasn't aware of any signs of life or what have you, and we could argue and back that backwards and forwards all day. I think, and again, this is for me, at that time, what Al did was very much the right thing for the wider forces involved, because there was a very, very, very high chance that if we had gone out the gate again, and bearing in mind I'd already been on the ground that day and been shot at, so we've already had our kind of roll of the dice.
Yes.
I truly believe, knowing the amount of insurgents that were working around the area, that there would have been more ISAF casualties. And worst case scenario is that the vehicle, whether that had been a road vehicle or indeed an airframe, that would have been targeted. So he did the right thing for me in the wider community. But
why
you're
do you
right.
think he wasn't so well supported? Why did his superiors and then the wider legal profession not see things from his point of view first time around?
But I don't think it was all of his superiors. I think there's a minority in any institution where they, through their own beliefs, and I'm not going to argue their beliefs, because I do think that some of their beliefs are for the right reasons, but it's very hard for them, and it was very hard for us to take all of that goodwill policy that we were trying to apply in Afghan in the actual situations we were involved with. So I don't know. I don't know why there was a minority or a majority.
See, one of the judges at the court proceedings said, in one moment you undermined much of the good work done day in and day out by British forces and potentially increased the risk of revenge attacks against your fellow service personnel. Now, that was a view of the judge in one of the earlier court proceedings.
Yes.
Do you understand where that judge is coming from?
I think, well, I can understand his words, and I can understand why he probably believed that that was right at the time, but I don't think the wider picture was really presented to the court. I don't think he would have been aware that, you know, the majority of the guys and girls around Sergeant Blackman would have been, you know, it would have really, really struggled to start applying the Geneva Convention, because it was towards
Indeed, there's a suggestion that if he hadn't done what he did, maybe some of his members of his particular group may well have done it anyway.
Well, I mean, you can see that on the footage. Yeah.
All right, let's talk a little bit about how this phenomenon, we now recognise it, post-traumatic stress disorder is now a recognised thing, how it applies to military personnel, and in this particular condition, this sort of distorted reality. How do you think, whatever unit you belong to, the superiors should carry out their duty of care to those who are working from them now and who cease to work from them at some point in the future? What is it, the onus on them to do you think?
I think we need to accept that we're not unbreakable. I think, you know, we all went there with a lot of bravado and feeling like that, you know, we could cope, and I didn't cope. You know, towards the end of my 7 months in Afghanistan, I wasn't right. You know, there was definitely a degradation, and whether that had undermined my own ethics and morality, I don't know. I'd have to have someone kind of delve into my mind. But I definitely recognise a different person at the beginning of the operation, transversing through the centre of the operation when it was very kinetic, and that's where all the blood and gore was happening. And then this individual left at the end of that, who was, I would describe myself as fairly reckless. I was convinced I was going to die anyway, you know, because everyone around me was dying. I think once you see that level of, I don't know how to best describe it, but how the Afghans that we were mentoring, how they did their business.
Yes, very different to British forces.
Very, very different. Barbaric, I would say. That's a word I'd describe.
And do you think there was a transference of that, some of that barbarism?
I think probably, yeah.
Into UK personnel?
I think probably, yeah. I think it's inevitable, and you know, I'm lucky in the sense that I've been through several different training systems. So not only did I go through the Royal Marine Commando training as a young soldier, then through my junior command course, senior command course, I've also been to Hendon and trained as a police officer. So I've seen a very, very wide spectrum of enforcement. But, you know, with all that goodwill and being a father, a husband, all the values and everything that I valued, I didn't have them at the end of that tour because they were so far away from where I was and what I was being asked to do.
That was then. Do you think you've got some of them back, Rob, now?
I hope so, yeah. I think, but I don't think it...
So the story, if we look for a bit of optimism, the adjustment disorder that happens can be repaired, reinstated?
Yeah, I think so, but, you know, I've had to seek professional help.
Yeah.
And people have had to tell me, and, you know, a lot of my close family, I'm lucky I've got a very supportive network that have grabbed me and kind of led me in the right direction. But, you know, I don't know how long that time has been from when I came back to how far percentage-wise I am to what I was before. And will I ever be? You know, can I ever expect to be exactly the same as I was before I've seen and done some of the things that we did on that tour?
Thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you very much.
And that's all for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Inside.